On this video, we want to focus on the claim of counter-missionary Rabbi Tovia Singer that Paul was lying when he claimed to have studied at the feet of Gamaliel, who would have been a leading Pharisaical scholar in the early first century, or if Paul wasn't lying, that Luke made it up later and put it in the book of Acts. Let's look at the key text here. Acts chapter 22, verse 3. Paul, speaking to his Jewish people in Jerusalem, says this: I am a Jew born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in the city, educated at the feet of Gamaliel, according to the strict manner of the law of our fathers, being zealous for God, as all of you are this day. All right, so what does Rabbi Singer have to say about this?
Paul was a student of Gamaliel is one that Paul would never have the audacity to make, because Paul's writings are all in the 50s. And in the 50s, people could check it out because Rabbi Gamaliel was alive in the 50s. Rabbi Gamaliel died in the 50s. So if you would make such a claim in the 50s, it's not that everybody could check it out, but it was an outrageous claim. But that claim is made in the book of Acts. The book of Acts is written 80, 85, 90, it's very much later. So therefore, by the time you're at the end of the first century, then you can claim anything you want to.
All right, this is an absolutely outrageous claim. First, in earlier writings of Paul that Rabbi Singer acknowledges were written by Paul, and other scholars acknowledge, biblical scholars acknowledge were written by Paul, like Philippians and Galatians. He makes reference to his lifestyle. In Philippians 3, he said he was a Pharisee of the Pharisees and blameless according to the law. I mean, really going for it, zealous. In Galatians 1, he talks about how he's advancing in Judaism, so in the traditions of his day beyond his compatriots. So he was going for it. You say, well, why didn't you mention Gamaliel there? Who says that the Philippians and Galatians ever heard of Gamaliel? But he's painting the same picture about himself. Nothing contradictory here. But here in Jerusalem, it makes sense. So he's going to tell his people in Jerusalem about it. You say, well, what about Rabbi Singer's claim that it's so late that this is not written in Acts until 85 or 90, no one could check it? Well, there are scholars who believe Acts was written before the year 70. All right. But let's just say it was written as late as 85 or 90. Is Rabbi Singer kidding me? He knows full well that things were passed down orally for generations. What is he going to say to Rabbinic Judaism? Look, when is the first major written document of Rabbinic Judaism? It's the Mishnah, written around 220 AD. So almost 200 years after the death of Jesus. And it's quoting from people not just in the second century, in the first century, but in the centuries before that. It's quoting from those who were called the Zugot, teachers who were passing on traditions in the centuries leading up to the time of Jesus. So I guess we should just throw out the Mishnah because it's quoting things from so much earlier before it's actually written down. And what about the Babylonian Talmud, which is the foundational series of books of Rabbinic Judaism? That reaches its final compilation under the Savarim in the 7th century of this era. And it's quoting from people 300, 400, 500, 600, 700 years earlier, allegedly passed down by oral tradition. You're telling me that if somebody allegedly makes something up, that Paul was a student of Gamaliel, they make this up and they circulate it in Jerusalem by the end of the first century, that there wouldn't have been plenty of people? So what are you talking about? My teacher, his teacher, studied under Gamaliel. Or my father's father studied under Gamaliel. There was no such, that's rubbish, that's bogus. What an utterly preposterous claim. Yikes, one that completely undoes the transmission of rabbinic literature. Again, no surprise, in virtually all of Rabbi Singer's videos, when he's making a big point, he ends up refuting himself. And that's why we show you these things, so you can test for yourself. Don't believe me, don't believe him. Test, examine, dig, study. Truth is what drives me more than anything else. All right, so what do others say, though? Maybe other Jewish scholars, maybe other Christian scholars. What did they make of this claim that Paul studied at the feet of Gamaliel? How about Rabbi Jacob Emden, one of the highly respected rabbis in the Jewish community in the 18th century? All right, and in terms of rabbis, Tovia Singer is known as a counter-missionary rabbi in certain circles, right? But Rabbi Jacob Emden is a highly respected rabbinic scholar. Okay, so you're talking about two different universes here. What does Rabbi Emden say? Listen to this, 1757. Paul was a scholar, an attendant of Rabbi Gamaliel the elder, well-versed in the laws of the Torah. He had no problem accepting what the New Testament said. Why? Because as he read Paul, he said, yeah, that makes sense. That looks like someone who studied at the feet of Gamaliel, and I have no reason to reject the claim that he did. Rabbi Jacob Emden. Who are you going to believe? Rabbi Emden or Rabbi Singer? Let's look at some New Testament scholars, people who are learned, who know Jewish literature well, who know the scholarly debate in Jewish and Christian circles well. I. Howard Marshall, in his commentary, Luke, Acts, getting into these things, he says, it has been denied that Paul was a pupil of Gamaliel, but on quite inadequate grounds. Joachim Jeremias has demonstrated that Paul not only handles the scriptures in the rabbinic manner, but more precisely in the manner of the school of Hillel, which would have also been the school of Paul under Gamaliel, right? Gamaliel being part of the Pharisaic school of Hillel, and Paul studying under there, Saul of Tarsus, Shaul studying under him. So I had Marshall saying, yeah, Joachim Jeremias, leading German scholar, who also knew rabbinic literature well, New Testament scholar, that he demonstrates that Paul's thinking is in line with this. Obviously, he is a new creation now in the Messiah, but the reasoning process or the things he refers to or the arguments he makes, you could say, yeah, that person studied there. John Polhill, look at what he says, another New Testament scholar. Acts 22:3 is the sole New Testament reference to Paul's education under Gamaliel, and this tradition has often been challenged by scholars on the grounds that his letters do not reflect formal rabbinic training. Although you'd wonder why they would if he's writing these letters to Gentiles, etc. But more recent scholarship, however, has indicated many points at which Paul reflected thoroughly rabbinic thoughts. When you dig deeper, it's there. And in his letters, Paul himself referred to his thorough training in and zeal for the law. Galatians 1:14, Philippians 3:4-7, which I previously referenced. Again, this is the very point Paul wanted to underscore with the Jerusalem Jews. Far from being a lawbreaker, as they were now accusing him, Paul's former life had been marked by a zeal for the law that matched or exceeded their own. Another New Testament scholar, and these are highly respected scholars in Jewish and Christian circles as well, among biblical scholars. Robert H. Stein. During this period of being educated in Jerusalem, Paul studied at the feet of a leading Pharisaic teacher, Gamaliel, Acts 22:3. Although Paul makes no direct reference to this in his letters, this accords well with several of his statements. Certainly, if he studied under Gamaliel, he could boast of being a Hebrew of the Hebrews with respect to the law of Pharisee and according to the righteousness which comes from the law blameless. Again, Philippians 3, which we cited. Paul's father, who himself was a Pharisee, Acts 23:6, no doubt intended such an education for his son. Such an education placed Paul in a good position later to acquire letters of authority in order to continue his persecution of the church in Damascus, Acts 9, Acts 22. The main argument against accepting Luke's description of Paul at this point is the argument from Paul's silence on the matter. It is assumed that if this were true, Paul would have mentioned his having studied under Gamaliel somewhere in his letters. It is precarious, however, to build an argument on silence, and it must be remembered that the Pauline letters are also silent about Paul's place of birth. Yet there are a few scholars who doubt that, as Luke says, it was Tarsus. That's why you even have books like Brad Young's Paul, the Jewish theologian. When you dig, when you understand his method of thought, you could say, yeah, this man was trained as a Pharisee. This man was trained in what would become early rabbinic thought and logic. You can see it in use of scripture and things like that, similar use of quotation or method of thinking. But now, this man is a new creation in the Messiah. Now this man is bringing people into a revelation that Jesus, Yeshua, is the Messiah of Israel. So there is every reason to believe what Paul says about himself in Acts 22 and that Luke is passing it on accurately. There are Jewish and Christian scholars who agree on that, and a leading 18th century rabbi who affirms it. You know, when I came to faith in Jesus, Yeshua, I was just 16 years old. I knew very little Hebrew, very little of the Bible. Immediately, my dad asked me to talk to the local rabbi, who was a brilliant man. He introduced me to other rabbis. Before you know it, I'm talking to ultra-Orthodox rabbis that have been studying Hebrew all their lives, and I barely even know the alphabet. And they threw so many questions at me. I was determined, I just need to know the truth. As a Jew, I want to be obedient to God and honor God. If I'm wrong about this faith in Jesus thing, then I'll abandon it. And if I'm right, I don't care if the Jewish community rejects me. I have to be obedient to God as a Jew, as a son. But the more I studied, The more I dug, even got a PhD in Near Eastern languages and literatures at New York University and spent hundreds, probably thousands of hours interacting with counter-missionaries and rabbis and other religious Jews and Jews who didn't believe. The more I studied, the clearer it was Jesus, Yeshua, is the Messiah of Israel and the Savior of the world. And what I wanted to do was be in a position to help you in your questions, your studies, your wondering. So we put together 5 volumes. I worked on these for years. 5 volumes, each of them tackling different areas. Volume 1 of Answering Jewish Objections to Jesus deals with general and historical objections. Volume 2, theological objections. Volume 3, Messianic prophecy objections. Volume 4, objections based on the New Testament. Volume 5, objections based on rabbinic tradition. You'll find comprehensive answers to so many questions that have come your way. And the more you study, the more you'll see Jesus, Yeshua, is the Messiah of Israel.